the practice of these guys having good jobs in the governor's mansion, rather than by saying we need to re-examine our criminal justice policies. And so we want to start that dialogue, but we also want to make sure that it's focused in a way in which we're actually talking about how do we create real change. So I know that a lot of folks in this room probably have some experience or understanding of the criminal justice system, so I don't want to waste too much time belaboring the facts and statistics, but at the same time they are so critical that I'm going to spend just a little bit of time kind of honing them in on them again. So first of all, the United States, as many of you might already know, is the world's leading jailer. So we have a higher incarceration rate in this country than anywhere else in the world. With over 2 million people in prison, we have just a fifth of the entire world's population, yet we have 25% of the world's people in prison. That's astounding. The funding implications are significant. This graph on the wall shows the dollar-for-dollar trade-off between corrections and higher education in the 10 years that I was in junior high school and high school in New York. When I look at that funding trade-off, it's no surprise that college has become so expensive, because we know where all the money is going. And the impacts by race are very, very significant. So research has demonstrated that when a white youth, a black youth, and a Latino youth are accused of committing the exact same crime or the exact same offense, that the rates in which the individual is sentenced, convicted, prosecuted, arrested, and the time that they spent in jail is at each stage of the system disproportionately longer and more punitive for black and Latino youth. So when we talk about the 1 in 3 young black men that are currently under criminal justice supervision in the United States, we have to be clear that that is not a result of criminal behavior or certain communities practicing more criminal behavior, as much as it is a result of an inherently biased criminal justice system that treats defendants of color more punitively and harsher than they do white defendants accused of committing the same crimes. So I talked earlier about the sentence of life without parole for juveniles. These are the faces of some of the individuals from Louisiana who are currently serving life sentences for offenses committed when they were 15 or 16 years old. So another factor in the U.S.'s incredibly high incarceration rate is the fact that our sentences are much harsher than anywhere else in the world. So it's actually true that just in the last couple of years, the United States Supreme Court has issued 2 rulings in Sullivan and Graham v. Florida and in Jackson and Miller that it is unconstitutional to sentence a child to mandatory life without parole, and it is unconstitutional to sentence a child for a non-homicide offense to life without parole. So that is certainly some progress, but I will tell you that how the states are implementing those decisions is something that continues to unfold. So in Louisiana right now, the District Attorneys Association is saying that that Supreme Court decision, that it is unconstitutional to sentence a juvenile to mandatory life without parole, should not apply retroactively to any of the close to 300 individuals that are currently serving that sentence. And so these individuals are currently languishing behind bars as we fight it out in the courts. The costs are staggering. $68 billion on corrections in 2010. And as articulated by the NAACP, what this is reflected as is over the past 20 years, nationwide spending on higher education has increased by 21%, while corrections spending has increased by 127%. The good news is, and there is actually a lot of good news amidst all this, is that we are beginning to see some unlikely allies who are also looking at the astounding cost of corrections and saying that this is not something that we can afford. So Newt Gingrich and Pat Nolan put out an op-ed in a number of the nation's largest papers and said, the prison population is growing 13 times faster than the general population. These facts should trouble every American. We can no longer afford business as usual with prisons. The criminal justice system is broken, and conservatives must lead in fixing it. So I know I and a number of my peers who've been kind of struggling to raise a microphone to these issues for years have been very heartened to see that conservatives are also beginning to come on board. You know, we would certainly say conservatives must lead in fixing it, progressives must lead in fixing it, Democrats, Republicans, Green Party, Independent. This is really an issue that impacts all of us. And it impacts all of us not just because it's the civil rights issue of our time, although I deeply believe that it is, but it impacts all of us because when we hear our representatives in Washington argue about the deficit and the debt ceiling and talk about the cuts that they have to do to food stamps and the gutting of programs like Head Start and other government programs, we know where those dollars are going. And we know that there is a way that we can actually find the funds to invest in the social programs that will actually keep us safe if we can turn around our broken criminal justice system. So, as James spoke about earlier, there have been some exciting victories that I've seen in the last few years, and I really do see a tide changing. So, when I first started working in New York State, it was about 2001. And at that time, we were looking at the unbelievable rate in which prisoners from New York City were housed in upstate New York prisons. It seemed as though the extent to which prisoners from New York City were feeding the economic development, usually more the hope of economic development than actually the reality, was going to produce a system in which we would never be able to see real reform. But after literally years of organizing that resulted in the repeal of New York's mandatory minimum Rockefeller drug law sentences, amongst a number of other factors, we were able to see a significant decrease in the prison population. And in just the last few years, Governor Cuomo in New York has shut down 11 state prisons. That is huge. And it is, I could speak at great length just about everything that's come along with that, including the effort by those counties in upstate New York to actually try to figure out alternative economic development plans that are not dependent and contingent upon mass incarceration. And it's a story that's still unfolding. But it is incredibly heartening to see us begin to finally separate the issue of mass incarceration from the issue of economic development, because those two things should not go hand in hand. And finally, another story that I want to share is the story of New Orleans, which is where I currently call home. Before Hurricane Katrina devastated the city, or the levees failed us, we had the dubious distinction in the state in the country with the highest rate of incarceration in the world, in the state of Louisiana with the highest rate of incarceration, and in the city of New Orleans, which had the highest rate of incarceration within that. We had the dubious distinction of calling ourselves kind of ground zero for incarceration. So our jail was 7,500 beds pre-Hurricane Katrina. Just to give a little bit of context for that, there are less than 400,000 people in the city of New Orleans. The city of New York, with 8 million people, has 13,000 people in their jail. So the size of our jail was exponential and really driven by low-level offenders who are getting picked up for offenses such as riding a bike on the sidewalk, traffic tickets, attachments, fines and fees, things that would not even necessarily get you booked into a jail in another city. But in New Orleans, we're having people locked up for days at a time. So when the levee walls failed and the floodwaters kind of devastated the jail, there's, by the way, a lot that can be said about the horrible things and conditions that happened in that facility while the floodwaters were there, but that's for another talk or another time. But one of the things that it did was it gave us an opportunity to say, how can we do something different